And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Today's sea ice analysis showing a decrease in sea ice conditions here the last couple of days from what they were earlier in the week and last weekend here, especially in Bristol Bay and up around Nunivak Island. And that pattern is going to continue here at least through this weekend into the first of next week as those strong south and southeast winds move into the area, continue to diminish this portion of the sea ice here and push the edge maybe back to the north or northwest a little bit. And for the weather tonight, big intense low pressure area here moving into the Aleutians with storm and gale force winds associated with it. And that tracks northward, and high wind warnings out for the central eastern Aleutians, Alaska Peninsula, maybe the Pribilof Islands, and winter storm watches and warnings out for the Yukon Delta into the southwest interior areas. And looks like strong winds as that front passes into Bristol Bay tomorrow with increasing wind and rain. Kodiak Island, mixed precipitation into the southwest interior areas. Stays dry with less wind, especially along the Arctic coast. Over the interior, dry for the Panhandle. And then increasing clouds, increasing chances of precipitation along the coast of the Panhandle on Sunday. Winds back up on the increase here for the eastern Milford Sea coast with gale and storm force winds out in that area, especially around Barter Island, Kaktovik. Wind, snow, blowing snow over the western interior here. Strong winds into the Pribilofs. Winds diminishing here, definitely down below storm force levels for the eastern Aleutians Sunday and Sunday afternoon, and even lighter winds out to the west. Coastal water forecast for the south coast of the Panhandle tomorrow. North winds 15 to 20 knots. North winds 10 knots for the central coast, and up north, east-northeast, light 10-knot winds. Lane Canal, north winds 15 knots, northeast at about 10 for Stevens Passage, and northwest 15 for Clarence Strait. Outlook for Sunday, Clarence Strait, southeast winds 20 knots, southeast 15 for Stevens Passage, Lane Canal, Glacier Bay, northeast at 10. Small craft advisories here along the central and south coast for east to southeast winds at 25 knots. And then stronger winds up to the north here, all out of the east, 30 to 40 knots. And then for Prince William Sound tomorrow, variable winds, 15 knots, seas 2 feet. East winds, 15 to 20 knots for the North Gulf Coast. Cook Inlet, northeasterlies, 15 to 25 knots. Gale warnings, Kamishak Bay, east winds coming up to 35 knots, seas building to 12 feet. Southeast 30 knots for the Barren Islands. And for the day on Sunday, gale warnings for the North Gulf Coast, east to southeast winds, 35 to 40 knots. Small craft advisories, Prince William Sound, for east winds at 30 knots with 7-foot seas. Southeast 40-knot winds for the Barren Islands. Gales for Kamishak Bay out of the east at 35 knots. Small craft advisories for Cook Inlet, northeast winds 25 knots. And Kodiak Island, east to south winds tomorrow at 30 knots. And storm warnings for the western Alaska Peninsula for 55 to 60 knot winds. Eastern Alaska Peninsula, gale warnings, 40 to 45 knot winds out of the southeast. And King Salmon, southeast winds, 45 knots. Next day, southwest and south winds, 35 to 40 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. South at 30 knots for Bristol Bay. Kodiak Island, southwest winds behind the front, 20 to 25 knots. And for Saturday, eastern Aleutians, very strong storm force winds going there. Out of the south, 60 to 65 knots sustained. Seas anywhere from 14 to 40 feet there. And Adak and Atka, storm warnings. Northwest winds at 60 knots with seas 20 to 25 feet. And storm warnings all the way out to Kiska Island, northwest 50 knots there. And then gales from Kiska to Shemya for northwesterlies at 30 to 35 knots. And then for the day on Sunday, there we go. We'll see down to gale force winds here for the eastern Aleutians, west-southwest 40 to 45 knots. West 40-knot gales for Adak and Atka, extending all the way out to Kiska Island, and then 30 to 35 knots, Kiska to Shemya. And for Kuskokwim Delta coast here for Saturday, storm warnings. Southeast winds 50 knots, east 40-knot winds for Norton Sound, the Yukon Delta coast, and St. Lawrence Island. And basically storm force winds here, St. Matthew Island and the Pribilofs, 45 to 50 knots. And for Sunday, west winds 45 knots for the Pribilof Islands. That low center lifts northward there, but still northeast 45 knots for St. Matthew Island. And the Kuskokwim Delta coast has a southeast wind of 55 knots blowing right into Nunivak Island. Yukon Delta coast, the winds turn easterly at 45, and then 40-knot winds out of the east for Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, tomorrow, lighter winds. East 30 to 35 knots. Brisk wind advisories for the central and western coast, east at 25. Gale warnings for the Chukchi Sea, east winds 35 knots. And for the day on Sunday, gale warnings for the Chukchi Sea, east winds 35 to 40 knots. Brisk wind advisories for the western Arctic coast here, east at 30. Gale warnings for the central Arctic coast, east 40 knots now. And for the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, gale and storm force winds there, with the storm force winds again around Kaktovik, Barter Island to Demarcation Point for east winds at 50 knots.